Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and this week's contract tip has to do with earnest money and some issues that we're having with lenders and then contractual issues. So when you're working with a buyer and the buyer is putting in earnest money in a contract, remember that the lender has to source those funds, has to be able to track where that earnest money came from. It can't be cash, and it can't come from a cash account. If it comes as a gift from somebody, the lender has to be able to track and source that earnest money and where it comes from in order to process the loan and for the loan to get through underwriting. So the issues that we're having is a lender can't source the funds, the source of the earnest money for whatever reason. So, okay, let me back up. Buyer has put in earnest money and the holder is holding it. Let's say it's the broker holding the earnest money. Then as the loan goes through processing and goes through underwriting, it turns out that the lender cannot use that earnest money because the lender can't source those funds. So the lender contacts you, the agent, and says, hey agent, we need for you to amend the contract taking the earnest money out of the contract. So contractually, on one hand, that's fine. You do not need earnest money for an enforceable contract. Earnest money is not the consideration of the contract. So you don't need earnest money in the contract. And as long as it's okay with both the buyer and the seller, the parties can amend the contract, removing the earnest money from the contract. So on one hand, that's all good to go. The issue is, if you are the seller, if you're the listing agent representing the seller, you don't necessarily want to remove the earnest money from the deal, because let's say the broker is holding the earnest money. If the buyer and the seller sign an amendment removing the earnest money from the contract, and then let's say the buyer defaults, well, the broker cannot give the earnest money to the seller as liquidated damages for the buyer's default, because the buyer and the seller agreed that the earnest money is no longer a part of the contract. So there is a risk for the seller to remove the earnest money. So it's fine to sign an amendment for the parties removing the earnest money from the contract, and if all that is done after the contract closes, the broker then can return the earnest money that the broker was holding back to the buyer. If you're on the listing side, however, you don't want to do that. You don't want to sign that amendment until you are actually sitting at the closing table, because should the buyer default, there is no liquidated damages for that buyer's default. So just a couple things to keep in mind. Definitely you want to head this off at the path, so to speak, by having a conversation with the buyer when you first meet with the buyer regarding earnest money, and making sure that the buyer has a comprehensive conversation with the lender regarding the earnest money, where it can come from, that it has to be sourced, so forth and so on. Thank you so much for watching. Again, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.